Welcome to the Explore Words, Discover Worlds podcast, presented by Bradford Literature Festival. In this episode, Dr. Afshin Sahahi and Yavid Alipur explore the enduring impact of the Mosaddegh coup in Iran, 70 years after this pivotal event. Recorded at the 2023 Bradford Literature Festival, this episode delves into Iran's role in the Middle East, its global relationships and its future in a complex geopolitical landscape.
This year at the Bradford Literature Festival is looking at the Middle East and some of these very important dates. This one, I think, clearly fits into that, not only within the national narrative of Iran, but really also, I would argue, in the national narrative of Great Britain, the United States, and of course occurring within the broader backdrop of the Cold War. And that is the 1953 coup d'etat overthrowing a democratically elected Prime Minister Mosaddegh in Iran, and looking not only at the causes of the coup itself, but then also what were the consequences of the coup. So we will have a discussion, a conversation for roughly about 40 minutes, and then we will certainly reserve some time for what I'm sure are some very trenchant questions that you have for my esteemed panelists here. So let's get started first with what was Iran positioned as being in the years of World War II. Let's kind of go back a little bit before 1953. How did things look? And whoever wants to go ahead and jump in. Okay, Afshin.
Well, first of all, thank you very much for chairing the panel, and thank you very much for attending this session. I didn't know that Mosaddegh's kind of history can generate so much interest. I was so surprised to see 35 people attending this event, and hopefully within the next 45 minutes we can address some of the issues related to this very, very important episode of Iranian history, as you mentioned. Of course, when we talk about kind of the First World War and the Second World War, very rarely we think of the Middle East, very rarely we think of Iran. But Iran was heavily affected by the Second World War. It was occupied by both Russia and Britain. Not only it was occupied by these two kind of great powers, but it also played a very important and instrumental role for the victory of the Allies in the war. And as most of you probably know, the most important kind of phase of the 20th century immediately after the Second World War is obviously the Cold War. And the Cold War started in Iran. When the Brits and the Russians kind of agreed to occupy Iran, the agreement was that immediately after the war that they have to withdraw their forces, and for combination of reasons that maybe we can talk about them later on, they wanted to kind of keep Iran independence. But immediately after the war, not surprisingly, Joseph Stalin refused to withdraw. And he wanted to kind of create a communist satellite state in Azerbaijan. And actually, to a degree, he was successful. Kind of that puppet kind of state kind of popped up. And that kind of triggered the very beginning of this kind of lengthy confrontation between the Soviet Union and the United States. That's something that we recognize as the Cold War. So Iran came out of the war extremely shattered, exhausted. The resources of the country were exploited both by the Russians and the Brits, despite the fact that Iran declared a neutral position before the war, but it paid a very heavy price. A few decades before that, the country kind of experienced another very, very important episode, and that was the constitutional revolution. And that kind of paved the way for the establishment of the first constitutional monarchy in Asia. Despite the fact that the war and kind of the political instability really did not kind of create a functioning democracy, but in the kind of early 1950s, Dr. Mosaddegh who was actually the cousin of the wife of the previous Qajar monarch, king Nasruddin Shah, who ruled Iran for about kind of 50 years. He was elected by the Majlis, by the parliament, and he comes to power. And at that time, very briefly, I just wrap up, the Iranian oil industry effectively was monopolized by Anglo-Iranian company. Today, we recognize it as British Petroleum. And obviously, Iran was getting a very kind of unfair share of the deal. And of course, Iran was one of the first country that oil was discovered in the Middle East in 1908 by William Darcy. So basically, the nationalization movement kind of gained momentum in the early 1950s, which was led by Mosaddegh, and he managed to finally nationalize an oil industry which at the time was very much like the Suez Canal, monopolized by the foreign powers, including the United Kingdom.
Right. I mean, just to show you how strategically important Iran was, especially in World War II, remember at this time Hitler had invaded the Soviet Union by breaching the Ribbentrop-Molotov Non-Aggression Act, or Pact, and the only way to get supplies into the Soviet Union were by way of Iran. Iran also having been occupied by the Russians and the British, and serving as a buffer state between the two empires even before World War.
They called it the Bridge of Victory.
It was the Bridge of Victory. A bit of an anecdote regarding America's involvement in the Middle East. The American who was in Iran directing the supplies through it was a man whose surname was Schwarzkopf. And of course his son then returns to the region in Iraq in 1991 as General Stormin Norman Schwarzkopf, who was the leader of Operation Desert Storm. So American fascination with the region actually existed before that. Javad, you have the situation where Iran is now trying to restabilize itself after a very traumatic period during World War II. 1941, the former Shah, Reza Shah, abdicates in favor of his son, Mohammad Reza Pahlavi, who then is in power in this constitutional monarchy as Iran emerges from the war. And right around this time in 1950, there is the enactment of the Nationalization Act. So take us through that a bit.
Well, I suppose thank you, thanks for having us. I suppose what the kind of introductory remarks I might make, if you like, or the kind of contextual remarks about that period, I would say that, first of all, obviously the abdication of Reza Pahlavi in favour of his son happens at the moment where the British and the Russians occupy the country. So it's not perhaps the most voluntary abdication that's ever happened in human history. And his son sort of takes over from that. I think in terms of thinking about this period more broadly, there's probably a couple of things that's really interesting to say. One of which is, as Afshin very succinctly put it, this is in the context of some stuff that's starting in the Constitutional Revolution and even before. And I think one of the ways that you can think about, one of the many ways you can tell the story of Iranian politics from kind of 1906 onwards is you can talk about a bigger and bigger constituency, as it were, entering the stage of history in terms of thinking about themselves as being part of the nation of Iran, of thinking about there being a political project for them to be a part of. And in that moment that you're talking about, just after the Second World War, there is a new section of Iranian society which has kind of in the mix, having something to play for. If we go back to just like the 1870s, 1880s, Iran is so different to, let's say, Belgium of today that it's very difficult to sort of describe. It's not. It's a country where, for instance, in any great city, Tabriz or Tehran will be divided not only along lines of religious affiliation, but certain intra-Shia forms of religious affiliation that don't even exist anymore. Neighborhoods, in some cases, had a sort of quasi-ethnic status. I believe organizations around mahalles and this, they called them. And so we really can't oversimplify what a journey it's been to get from that point to a point where people think we are the members of a national community and we have some reason to fight for each other. So through the Constitutional Revolution and First World War and so on, like in a lot of countries that you could say met modernity through the intercession of imperialist powers to some degree, some of the first people who start to articulate kind of a sense of what it means to have a national identity as Iranians are very, very elite people, right? So people close to the center of power, the first people to meet modern ideas and so on. But one interesting thing about Iran is there's always been a bit of a movement from below there as well. And we can go into a slightly different conversation. But the point is, when we get to this moment after the Second World War, there are the beginnings of mass political organizations in Iran to some degree. So when we say that Mosaddegh was democratically elected, that there's caveats to that, right? He was elected, it wasn't a presidential election, he didn't win the election in that way. A series of governments fell and then he kind of ended up taking power. It wasn't, women weren't allowed to vote. There was no, so it was kind of democratic in the broad sense, but not necessarily as we would understand. But that pressure of those civil society organizations was trying to be built. So Mohammad Reza Pahlavi would inherit a country where the Tudeh party, which was the second great Iranian Communist Party, if you like, was a fairly substantial thing, right? So it was in the nascent, there was, in terms of industry in Iran, obviously it was still a country that wasn't industrial, far from it, but there were pockets of really important industry. Not only the crucial oil industry, where my understanding is the Tudeh had quite a lot of power amongst sort of salaried middle class, insofar as Iranians were allowed to be salaried and middle class there. They had, we'd say in Persian, nufuz, I've forgotten the English word, it is, nufuz, the memberships there, basically. They had people there, and also in terms of the working class base. Ditto, the Tudeh had quite a lot of membership in the garment industry in the cities of Persia and so on. And so you're at this moment where you have a increasing section of society that starts to think of itself as having a sense of political agency, that starts to look at Anglo-Iranian oil, now British Petroleum, which, has clear resonances with the classic colonial corporations of domination, right? Your East India companies, your so on and so on. And I think Mohammad Reza Pahlavi inherits a moment where not only are these civil society organizations being built, but the iron fist, as it were, of Reza Khan, his father's quite tough security atmosphere, has fallen apart. That's a verbose way of answering your question.
That was not verbose at all. I mean, you're talking about decades and centuries of history. I mean, the fact that you're able to distill it into 4.5 minutes is impressive. I know my students feel I could do that, but I have to drone on for 15 weeks. But then, I have to justify my paycheck. But I mean, you're looking at a longer arc. I mean, of political activism. I mean, we think about the tobacco protest of 1891, where after Nasruddin Shah had essentially given the national commodity over to a British interest, that brings about an almost immediate backlash, which mobilizes Bazari merchants, clergy, and others against him. He has to then rescind it. 4 years later, he's killed, leading then to the constitutional movement of 1907. By the way, Reza Aslan is here at the festival with his really excellent biography of Howard Baskerville, this young 20s-something recent graduate of Princeton University, goes to Iran and essentially becomes a martyr in this movement. And so it seems as though there's something in the ethos about the Iranian people to then invoke their, as you said, political agency. But I'm really struck by what you said about nationalism. And here we have this moment of moving from, say, notions of empire and maybe some level of balkanization to the state, to the idea of nationalism. And now we have a new product. We have oil. As you said, William Darcy, no relationship to a Jane Austen novel, coming in and describe a little bit about the Anglo-Iranian Oil Corporation at Abadan. Stephen Kinzer, by the way, has written a very good book called All the Shah's Men. He's a New York Times reporter looking at this issue. It would suggest that Anglo-Iranian was a partnership of equals, but I think reality is quite different from that.
I mean, certainly not. I mean, there was no partnership.
Tell us how you really feel.
Equals for obvious reasons. I mean, as you said, Javad, very correctly, that at the beginning of the 20th century, Iran, like so many other countries in the Middle East, were going through a lot of drastic transitions. And we should not forget that in the early days of the 20th century, the authority of the central government in Tehran literally did not go beyond a few streets, even in Tehran. At the time, Iran was considered as one of the most unstable countries, even by the regional standards, one of the unsafest countries, even by the regional standards. So some Iranian traders, if they had to travel basically across the country, it was in their interest to actually do it just like this, go through Iraq and then actually go to Tehran. So it was a lot safer to actually travel through the neighboring countries rather than Iran. And of course, the sense of nationalism was also a new thing. Iran was divided by so many ethnicities, by different languages were spoken across the country. Of course, the idea of Iran always existed, but nationalism, in the way we understand it today, is completely a new phenomenon. I mean, of course, where nationalism comes from has been the subject of academic debates for a very long time. I'm personally a modernist, but there are also some primordialists maybe in the room who believe that maybe there is something very organic and natural about nationalism. I certainly don't believe that. I don't believe there is anything organic or anything even natural about it. Nationalism is the product of modernity. It's one of the products of modernity, so we're effectively talking about basically a new phenomenon. And in the period that we are talking about, this is the very beginning of the modern Iranian nation-building process. And even at the time, if you kind of went beyond Tehran, different parts of the country effectively were ruled by different warlords. So the authority of the central government, as I said repeatedly, was very limited. So when the Brits arrived, of course, I mean, there was no kind of equal partnership because, effectively the country did not have the infrastructure. People did not even make sense of why, these Westerners care so much about these kind of little kind of smelly product under the ground. But, just after the First World War, British Navy, which at the time was the biggest kind of navy in the world, decided to switch their kind of fuel from coal to oil. So all of a sudden, within the context of the British Empire and beyond, oil kind of gained a lot of the kind of importance and significance. So kind of the Brits started to kind of invest heavily in the refineries, particularly in the southern part of the country, in the city of Abadan. And actually until about mid-1950s, the refinery in Abadan was the largest in the world. And effectively because of the coup, I mean, this is something that we're going to talk about, Abadan lost its kind of central significance, and it never ever was able to regain its kind of central position. So there was a very unequal relationship between the state and basically the Anglo-Iranian kind of company, despite the fact that, the oil was obviously geographically located in Iran, but the state was kind of getting a very insignificant portion of the profit. And actually when Mosaddegh comes to power, I mean, this is one of the main instigators where the row kind of started. Mosaddegh wanted to audit kind of the accounts of the Anglo-Iranian company to see what's happening, what goes in, what goes out. And then, of course, not surprisingly, kind of the Anglo-Iranian company kind of refused because they didn't have to, because in the end, it is the power that talks. And we are still talking about the time that Britain is still consider itself as a mighty kind of empire, a very important political player in the world stage. So in the early 1950s, already a sense of collective consciousness is about to emerge. The sense of national consciousness is about to emerge. The sense of Iranianness is about to emerge. When the sense of Iranianness comes into the play, when the sense of collective consciousness comes into the play, what follows is the sense of national entitlement. It is very easy to make that kind of argument. Now we are part of the same entity, we are part of the same body, we have a lot of resources, and maybe we can use actually these resources to build up kind of a better future.
And this had happened before. I mean, in 1911, the Russians objected to the Iranians trying to audit the books, and because the Iranians were bringing in Morgan Schusterman, an American, and they in fact gave an ultimatum to have to dissolve parliament, thrusting Iran into a bit of chaos right before the war. So the Nationalization Act of 1950 then is actually applied by Mosaddegh in 1951 after his election. According to international law, any country can nationalize an industry sector within its boundaries and its borders, provided it pays fair market value for that. Of course, that means that the prior owner would be cut off from any future revenue, and here there was ostensibly more oil to be drawn from the ground. How did the Iranian people take this nationalization, and how was it received in places like Whitehall and Washington?
So it's a really interesting question. I just want to put that in that context of what you were talking about before as well, if that's all right.
Sure.
I particularly enjoyed your description of Iran that Morgan Schuster walked into is a little bit of trouble. Like that's one way to put it. Yeah, that's
well, I mean, I'm in England. I have to understate things.
Yeah, that's right. That's right. What I would say is, so just like that example you were giving about the auditing of the books. So in the context of the Anglo-Iranian oil company and the Nationalization Act and the kind of row that is a brewing. What's really key to point out is, I think, is a couple of things that perhaps sometimes go against people's assumptions about the case. One is that where the knottiest parts of the actual row with the British there was a bunch of points of principle that the British wouldn't move on. The British, it seems, some of the documentary evidence, as far as I've read, seems to suggest now that the British were more willing to move on percentage division of profit than they were on what they perceived as points of principle, which was no Iranian has the right to audit the books, which was the bar on Iranians being allowed technical jobs, and which were these things that feel, to be honest with you, a bit more structural and actually just imperialist. It seems like they were willing to give ground on some of that stuff. And this is in a context where, in Kinsner's book, actually, there's a brilliant discussion of some kind of Russian colonial bod, because they're the power in the north, who sends one of these kind of like anthropological texts back to the government about advising them on policies on Iran. He says the thing about the Iranians is, he says the difficulty with Iranians is, they sometimes seem like they could do a technical job, but you mustn't trust them. Which I think I've always enjoyed that for some. I don't know. I think it raised a bit of a smile for me. So it's in that context, where some of that reception in your Whitehalls, in the State Department, is happening, and there is a huge amount of debate now around the other really important bit of context to give, which I think is fairly unproblematical, is to say that sometimes, especially centre-left politics, we are used to talking about kind of a Western imperialism in, let's say, in that region or in other regions. I think what's really important to say is the Americans and the British probably did work together to a certain degree to foment this coup, and there was, we can get into the details of that. But what's really important to say is, as far as I understand, in the rest of the region, it's one of the few times when the Americans and the Brits ended up on the same side trying to want to achieve the same thing with their policy, right? They hated each other in that region. I think it's fairly fair to say through most of the post-war period. And I think some of the understanding I have of this will come from there's an argument that the Americans have become relatively comfortable with giving. That around the time they've kind of the state, I can't remember who it was, but they apologized for their role in the coup, and that argument went, well, look, the British were being intransigent, as the British want to be. At the time, the British position was that they couldn't negotiate with Mosaddegh. Again, this was based on, to be honest with you, quite a lot of racism and cynicism. Mosaddegh was a very theatrical speaker and performer. He had a habit of, in these court cases around the nationalizations, he had a habit of passing out through the weight of emotion.
Yes.
I just think, what a guy, do you know what I mean? What a man. And this would trigger, like, his supporters would be Iranians, man. His supporters would then be in the street, like, beating their chests and screaming, give us death or give us Mosaddegh. You know, it's like yeah, exactly. Not a lightness of touch, people, historically. And British intelligence and British Foreign Office people write this up as, well, you can't, this man doesn't understand how you talk like a normal person. You see, he's a hysterical Easterner, that kind of thing. And so the American sort of position, remembering that, has become, well, the Brits were the Brits and kind of, perfidious Albion and wouldn't give anything up. And the Iranians were lunatics, and we just didn't want the communists to take over. And so, sort of by accident, we ended up in this position. But actually, this is in a context where there are huge amounts of American interest, like in Aramco in Saudi Arabia. There are American interests in oil companies in Venezuela and so on. And I think there's an argument that, from the American point of view, they were much less naive, falling into difficulties than perhaps they've claimed since.
Well, they were also a bit more removed from the kind of colonial and imperial experience and longevity of that in the region compared to the British, the Russians, and to a lesser degree the Americans. So you mentioned the whole idea about the communist threat. And again, this is the Cold War. And it seems as though in 1951 that was not perceived as being as dangerous as by 1953. The British had made efforts to try to persuade the United States to act upon what had happened. Truman was the president at that time. He was a bit distracted by this little thing happening, again, British understatement, on the 38th parallel in the Korean Peninsula. But 1953 brings about a new administration in Washington with Eisenhower, and perhaps more consequentially, two brothers. John Foster Dulles, former managing director of Sullivan Cromwell, a major Wall Street multinational company, thank you, and his far more promiscuous brother, Allen, across the Potomac River in Langley, Virginia, who was the director of the Central Intelligence Agency. And if you read Kinzer's other book called, quite cryptically, The Brothers, you will get a really wonderful and very contrasting biography of the two. The one area of convergence that both of them did seem to have is their view geopolitically, that if you weren't firmly ensconced in the American side of the ledger, there was no such thing as neutrality. You were de facto in the Soviet camp. And it seems as though this is how they viewed Mosaddegh, accusations of him being a bit too close to the Tudeh party, him, of course, being in the National Front Party. I'm sure through no dearth of cajoling by the British government on this. How did that then lead to the coup?
The history of the Tudeh party, the Iranian Communist Party, is very multifaceted and multidimensional. We could spend many hours just simply talking about the rise and the fall of the party. But obviously, I'm not going to bore you to death. So I'm just going to kind of shift our attention to our main kind of focus, which is the Mosaddegh era. Until about a year before the coup, in fact, the Tudeh party, which was banned a while ago because of obviously what happened immediately after the Second World War, because the communists wanted to kind of break apart the country. So Tudeh party was outlawed, but from late 1940s, early 1950s, because of combination of factors, we began to see a more kind of proactive Tudeh party in the country. So particularly in the areas that there were industries in the south, in Abadan, and in Tehran. Until about a year, the Tudeh party, a year before the coup, the Tudeh party regarded Mosaddegh as the agent of Uncle Sam, as the agent of the United States, as a kind of a political elite from Qajar. He's not the man of people. But when the nationalization kind of business came into the picture, apparently they kind of received a new mandate from Moscow to change their position. So all of a sudden, the Tudeh party became kind of more Catholic than the Pope. They became kind of very serious supporters of Mosaddegh, which obviously wasn't very advantageous to Mosaddegh himself. And the reason that it wasn't advantageous, that because, I'm actually still, I mean, this is a very divisive issue in Iran. I am personally very reluctant to use what happened in 1953, to use the term of coup d'etat. Because if you want to kind of look at it from the political science point of view, what happened in 1953 wasn't a coup d'etat. Did we see a kind of direct, unnecessary, illegitimate involvement of the United States and Britain? Yes, definitely. Do we have evidence to prove it? Yes, definitely. But was it a coup? Certainly not. Why there wasn't a coup? And now, sorry, I'm drifting from communism to this issue, but I will go back to it. Because constitutionally, Mosaddegh was dismissed by the king. He also unconstitutionally dissolved the parliament. He acted unconstitutionally. So basically, the Shah was under a lot of pressure by Britain and the United States, because they were afraid that maybe he's flirting a little bit too much with the Tudeh. He wasn't, but this was the perception at the time. Ashraf, his sister, the sister of the Shah, secretly went to Switzerland, and at the same time, the head of CIA, the American ambassador at the time, also joined them, and a couple of other figures. And basically, Ashraf came back to Iran to pass the message to the Shah that the United States and Great Britain want Mosaddegh to be moved from the political scene, because actually they felt a little bit uncomfortable, because Iran was geopolitically a very important area. It had a massive border with the Soviet Union and obviously the oil. So definitely they wanted to push the Shah to get rid of Mosaddegh. So Mosaddegh was under pressure. The Shah was under pressure, so he basically dismisses Mosaddegh. But instead of basically complying with the law, Mosaddegh basically arrests the person who passed. Basically, he shot the messenger, and that basically alarmed the Shah. At 4 o'clock in the morning, he woke up, and basically he was a pilot, and he and his wife Soraya left the country and went to Iraq. And what happened afterwards is so interesting, because the clergy, because of the fear of communism, played a very, very important role. Because when the Shah left, the supporters of Mosaddegh were talking about establishing a republic. The Tudeh party, the Communist Party, they managed to mobilize about 100,000 people in Tehran. That's a lot, basically, in the early 1950s. So they were absolutely horrified that if the Shah goes, they're going to establish a communistic, a Marxist republic in Iran. And of course, that would be a very bad news for the religious society and for the clergy. So the clergy, because of the fear of communism and the establishment of a kind of a republican system, hardly had any interest in basically Mossaddegh's project. And if it wasn't because of their involvement, if it wasn't because of their kind of push, probably we would see kind of the end of monarchy at that time. So although kind of the Tudeh party did not play a very important role, but the perception of the Tudeh party that if actually we kind of treat this matter a little bit loosely, the kind of the genie will get out of the bottle and we completely lose the control, played a very, very important role in that very, very fateful moment in the 20th century Iranian history.
Okay, so fair enough. I mean, you have now in the streets, you have a certain fomentation of anxiety that the Tudeh party have become perhaps a little bit too close, or at least the trajectory is seen as problematic. You've got the clergy who seem to be very robust in their concerns and voicing that. How then did the Americans and the British find a space in what otherwise could have been just simply an indigenous political movement and agitation?
I think there's a couple of things that are worth saying about that. The first is, I would just say about the Tudeh in that context, like as Afshin correctly said, I mean, my brother, I could definitely spend 5 hours talking about the Tudeh party because it's such an interesting thing, right? But I would say that, just to be really clear, absolutely like a Soviet-backed communist party, there is pressure from the Soviet Union, this should be the position. But it is also, it was a mass civil political organization. It had its own way of moving. It was, women's organizations, cultural organizations, all organized underground, trade unions, all of that. These thousands and thousands of people. So it was a real organic, living organization, and ran theatre companies and all kinds of things. So it wasn't something that could be. I think sometimes when we talk about that as a communist party, we can feel a little bit like we can sort of slide over a couple of things. Like I would just say that it seems to me when we talk about the clergy's reaction to the idea of the communists coming, well, when you look at people like so there were actually some clergymen who were pro-National Front, right? You sort of Ayatollah Talaganis and these people. But in terms of the more reactionary elements, Kashani, Behbahani, people like this, actually some of the stuff, what they think communism is, means stuff like schooling for girls, right?
And complete secularism, like what Ataturk
But that doesn't necessarily mean it's like what we might think.
They were kind of confusing things.
Absolutely, absolutely. And into that mix, you have basically the very, I think, shortest possible way of answering the question is you have obviously Britain as one of the heritage imperial powers in that part of the world, has a whole network of kind of influenced, organized around not just politicians but also people, powerful and less powerful bazaris, members of the clergy, players of various kinds. Incidentally, one of the things that in Evand Abrahamian's book about the coup, he talks about is a moment of panic early on when the British realise it's probably going to be impossible to bribe Mosaddegh. Like the guys go and try and do it, and he's not interested. And into that, you start to get this cohering of like the kind of American technologies of social change and so on, and kind of not quote unquote coup. I absolutely what Afshin said is a really important point.
We'll call it the thing.
The thing from
here on in.
Okay. Yeah. And you get these things coming together. There's a CIA operative called Kermit Roosevelt who arrives in Iran with a bunch of money and a bunch of ideas and connects to this network. Now, how much he individually was the driver of what happened is a huge debate. He, like a lot of sort of, let's say, colonial adventurer types, he likes to tell a story about what he got up to. So, do you know what I mean? Like, I'm not sure if all the daring do necessarily happened the way he says it happened. But in any case, quite a lot of resources thrown at this. And one, again, just to speak to what you're saying about the clergy, there's a sort of famous cliche, if you like, which you can find in a number of the kind of big, really good books about this period, where sort of so much of the networks of the kind of toughs and the thugs that are sent on the streets to smash the Tudeh and the National Front and to foment this unrest. So much of them are organised around the traditional networks of toughs of the bazaar who are connected to the clergy, that the money flowing around is, according to legend, referred to as Behbahani dollars. Because Ayatollah Behbahani is a guy who is, through 2 or 3 clicks, as you'd say on the internet, connected to where this money is coming in. Does that make sense?
Yes, definitely does. And actually, you made a very interesting point. Forgive me. You made a very interesting point that, for many decades, when we're talking about kind of the dark side of American history in the Cold War, usually we start with what happened in 1953 in Iran, because this was the first time that basically the United States was actively trying to go for regime change in the context of the Cold War. And we know what happened after that. We had so many other incidents in Guatemala, in Chile, in El Salvador, and actually many other countries. But despite the fact that the Americans and the Brits had the intention to remove Mosaddegh, but if you do look at kind of the existing historical evidence, effectively they failed. It's not that they didn't want to, it's not because they didn't have the intention, but they failed. Because, when they secretly met with the Shah's sister in France, they basically just they wanted to push the Shah to get rid of him constitutionally. And they assumed that if he's dismissed by the Shah, hopefully this would be the end of the matter. And actually they didn't envisage anything that would potentially follow after that incident. Obviously, Mosaddegh did not kind of accept the invitation to leave the political scene, and he stayed for 3 more days. And when the American ambassador, who at that time, when he heard that basically the Mosaddegh has declined. At that time, he was in Beirut. He immediately comes to Tehran. He kind of goes to meet Mosaddegh, and they tries to kind of reestablish ties. And based on kind of the documents which were kind of sent from Tehran, the CIA reports to Washington, they said that actually the operation has failed. So in the end, despite the fact that they had the intention, but they did not have the means to do anything about it, because within that 3 days, effectively, the army was in disarray. But what was the turning point? Again, going back to the role of the clergy. The clergy played a very, 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 very important role for the successful remove of Mosaddegh from the political scene. Because of that historic fear that kind of communism means atheism. Communism means no God. So communism means no religion. And you can imagine, this is the 1950s Iran, the Middle East. Even if you do look at kind of the European context at the time, I mean, we're dealing with a very kind of religious kind of landscape across the world. So the threat of being kind of confronted with a very kind of nihilistic, dangerous state like what we saw in the Soviet Union really alarmed the clergy. And that's why, despite the fact that in the first 2 days of the so-called coup, Mosaddegh had the upper hand, but actually he could not continue because he did not have the support of, at least in the way that a lot of people argue, a lot of historians argue, he didn't have the support of the vast majority of the people. If he had, he definitely would succeed because the Shah already left the country, the military was already in disarray, but he could not kind of complete the process. Why he could not complete the process? Because the clergy was not behind him, and actually the vast majority of the people were not behind him. And actually, if I say these things to a lot of Iranians, honestly, they're going to throw an egg, because this is one of the most divisive issues which actually sadly never ends in Iran. For some people, Mosaddegh is kind of the champion of freedom and liberalization and democratization, and to a degree he was. But then, at the same time, there are some other aspects as well that we need to bear in mind, and despite the fact that 70 years has passed, there is no kind of national consensus about those very 3 fateful days in Iran and the role of Mosaddegh in it.
Well, I don't think they'd throw eggs because they're too expensive now, so maybe something else. Clearly though, 53 is, and the domino effect was such a powerful trope in the Cold War that if one country goes communist, then the domino effect will occur. This, of course, was the whole notion that was sort of pushed onto Indochina. 53 seems to, though, be, at least in the perception of decolonialism, the first domino to go when it comes to nationalism. And then you mentioned Arbenz in Guatemala with bananas. You mentioned Suez in Egypt. We can talk about Lumumba in 61 in Congo. We can talk about Nkrumah in Ghana, Allende in 1973. Certainly one can talk about the inspiration drawn from the coup for the Algerian War of Independence, which begins the very next year and is quite brutal. But I'd like to just, before we open it up for questions, this notion of clerical agency. I mean, here we find that there was an agitation by the clerics in Iran, as they had been involved in the constitutional revolution in 1907, as they had been involved in the tobacco protest of 1891. Can we draw that line then to their political agency in 1978?
Can I comment on that a little bit? I would say a couple of things. Absolutely, as Afshin said, there isn't consensus in the country on what happened in those 3 days. My understanding is there's not scholarly historical consensus on what happened in those days. What we do know is that Mosaddegh ended up overthrown, and kind of in a way that's kind of similar to what the plan was. Do you know what I mean? How we get there, we don't know. In terms of that question about clerical agency, I would say, as Afshin was saying, absolutely, such an important point. It's meaningless to say Mosaddegh had the support of the broad mass of Iranians at that time. It's definitely not the case. But I suppose what I would add to that is I would say that in terms of that process of more and more, if we go back to the tobacco movement and the constitutional movement and so on and so on, each wave of those political movements, more people coming onto that stage, It seems to me that actually in the early 50s, in 52, 53, we can't even just say most Iranians didn't support Mosaddegh. We can still say a good proportion of Iranians didn't probably feel Iranian yet. Didn't feel like that was their purview. And it's clear that, like, for instance, the Tudeh, as I say, hugely impressive, massive, secular civil society organisation, one of the first ones in the Middle East. One of its many impressive things was its organisation of a secret military organisation, which in the great tradition of those kinds of third world communist organizations, full of all kinds of like mustached, dashing young NCOs with ideas about building dams and making their country modern, right? But it was a very serious organization, secret, underground, guys with military training. And what was it able to achieve in terms of the period of the coup? Pretty much fuck all, right? Because the other guys won, okay? So that's what that would suggest. Now, why is that? And I think there's two things we can talk about. One is actually the Shah having, it's very easy to think about the last Shah as a sort of playboy figure, in this. But there's moments of real political clarity to him and cleverness to him. And my understanding is that certain regiments that were based in Tehran, particularly tank regiments, were paid better than other members of the army, and their officer corps received political training about the nature of the Pahlavi regime that other members of the army didn't. So they were absolutely loyal to the Shah all the way through that. The other point, of course, is that a lot of the army would have been made up of national service boys and this kind of stuff. And this gets into this question for me that goes, super interesting, right? This country at this stage, there is a proportion of the country who are in a modern trade union or support the National Front or in Tehran. And they might be thinking, on either side of this, they're willing to die and be killed for Iran. But then there's a whole other section of the country where die or be killed for Iran just doesn't mean anything. What means something is the family you belong to and the tribe you belong to and the village and the this and the that. And so I think when we think about a lot of the decolonial history here, we often want to think about colonialism, imperialism as the West just did things. But actually, there's this whole other churn of social organisation working there, that's organic in its own regard. In answer to the clergy question, long story short, the clergy is a very complicated, contradictory, odd thing that has its whole own line of flight and development through the 20th century in Iran. You could say, if you were going to be a Marxist about it, you could say it's got its own sort of development as a class through the 20th century. And in fact, its role's been entirely contradictory all the way through that. It's very easy to look back and go, well, Khomeini took power in 79, so the development of the clergy in Iran was all leading towards, describe it how you want, a vicious, misogynistic, reactionary, whatever, anti-democratic regime. But actually, there were, I think it's fair to say, and Afshin can correct me on this, I think it's fair to say more of the clergy, certainly more of the famous clergy, supported the constitutional revolution than were against it. So, Fazlullah Nouri's against it, but a bunch of more famous people at the time are for it. For every Kashani who's anti-Mosaddegh in the Mosaddegh years, you have a Talaqani who's pro it and so on. And so it's important that we don't look back anachronistically and sort of do that thing where history becomes a prologue to the present.
Good point. And with that, let's go ahead and open it up to some questions. We have a roving mic. We have time for, I think, maybe 3 questions, 4 if we are on a diet.
Yeah. Could I don't want to widen this too far, but 1953, 1956, Eisenhower backs against the movement and the alleged coup against Mosaddegh. Why in 56 did he stop the British in Egypt from being successful in anti-Nasser and the nationalisation of the canal? What was the difference between Eisenhower's attitude in 53 and 56? Why did he change?
I think the Americans had a wildly different policy towards Nasser and Egypt to the British. I'm an artist who makes documentaries that post-documentary theatre that's to do with this, but my legitimate historian colleagues, I'm sure, have more to sort of say about that. But wildly different policies on Nasser.
Just the first disagreement between Britain and United States over Suez Crisis in 1956 was simply because of the fact that the Americans were not informed. the Brits did not even tell the Americans that they're going to take over Suez Canal. I mean, can you imagine? I mean, Britain, and that's why, a lot of modern historians regard the Suez kind of crisis as a turning point in the British role in the global politics. Because because Britain said, why should I consult with anybody? I mean, if we disagree with this country, we go and take over. And they did it, but obviously the United States did not like it very much. So they put a lot of pressure. And the other thing about 1953, as I said, at least based on the reliable historical evidence that I had been able to look at, I think the role of American involvement in the so-called the coup is very much exaggerated. We get kind of a lot of our data from a kind of book, a very unreliable book, which was published in 1978 by Kim Roosevelt, basically the CIA operative kind of agent in Iran. And obviously in that book, because he was kind of trying to justify his own actions and try to make a hero out of himself and say, actually, we did it, Americans actually orchestrated the coup. But when you do look at the evidence, when you do look at kind of the evidence on the ground, yes, the Americans wanted to get rid of Mosaddegh, but their involvement in that transition, in my opinion, is very, very much exaggerated.
I would say there's a few other things to consider. 56 was after 1954, which means it's after Dien Bien Phu. The United States has now taken over from France in Indochina. There's also an excellent book by Alex von Tunzelmann called Blood and Sand, which talks about 1956. Arguably, American involvement in the region and the Suez intervention was due in part to Hungary and the Soviet Union's invasion of Hungary in that year, and the prospect of the Soviet Union now turning its eye onto the Middle East, something that it really hadn't done in any great measure until this point. Of course, today's a whole different story with Russia being in Syria. But the fact that it was also an election year for Eisenhower in 1956, the idea of then being mired elsewhere was also something to consider. But I think that the point that Afshin made, that the United States was really bamboozled by both the British and the French and the Israelis by keeping them in the dark. I think we have time for one more question if someone has it. Okay, well then I'll go ahead. Oh, we do have a question. Okay, excellent. It's like an auction. You wait till the second going twice. Wonderful.
Thank you, guys. Just with regards to the whole history of British involvement, right from the setup of the Anglo-Iranian, the coup, all the other interference, and obviously since the Islamic Republic established, been at loggerheads constantly. What do you think? What would you like to? Big question. How would you see a productive engagement from the current or future British establishments for the benefit of the people of Iran? In terms of like an ethical, productive foreign policy, what do you think that specifically Britain, but the West could do to improve relations and to improve the prospects of democracy?
This is a fantastic question, but I believe it is for the next panel. Because, because I don't know if you have time or not, but I encourage you to stay, because the next panel is going to be about Women Life Freedom Movement. Both Javad and I going to be a part of that panel, and then maybe we definitely can talk about what Britain can do to empower people in Iran. And definitely there are a lot Britain can do, believe me.
Yeah, my question, since I'm not going to be on the panel, is nothing. I think that ship has sailed. I think when you have China investing $400 billion over 25 years in Iran, when you have China brokering a détente between the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia and Iran, I think the United States, the United Kingdom, and other Western parties are going to have to do a little soul-searching about how they can then make their case to have credibility within Iran, and to do it above board instead of something that might be seen as surreptitious, suspicious, and dangerous.
Yeah, but just very quickly, I mean, what I gather, I mean, when kind of I look at kind of the demand of the Iranian society today, I mean, we had 6 months of protests in Iran. Very rarely you heard somebody saying, I don't know, down with Britain,
never,
down with
never,
the
absolutely.
Never.
Well, the only people who say that would be people who support the regime.
Exactly. Yeah. So
I'm not disagreeing with you. I'm just saying that now that there are other superpower players, and I'm not saying this as to dissuade people from doing anything. I'm just saying that now the variables have changed dramatically.
Yeah, but I personally believe that, you know, I've been kind of lobbying a lot of politicians, and I have spoken to a lot of parliaments over the last 6 or 7 months, because I believe that given where Iran is at the moment economically, where the Islamic Republic is economically, there is a lot the Europeans can do. There is a lot the Americans can do. Of course, they can't create miracle. We don't want any military intervention. We don't want any kind of military involvement. But there is a lot politically and economically they can do to undermine the regime. But if the regime is actually selling more oil today than last year and the year before that and the year before that, that means basically the mechanisms of social control, the violent mechanisms of social control are still funded by the oil money. And believe it or not, maybe over the last 6 or 7 months, when the Iranian regime were killing Iranian protesters in streets of Tehran, you were using oil, which was sold in the black market by the Iranian agents to countries like Britain. And maybe you have not realized that. And it has happened.
Thank you. Thank you. What I would throw in is a couple of, there's a big answer to that. Absolutely just building what Afshin says, a kind of smaller answers to that. I would say definitely one thing you hear from people on the streets of Iran is tougher but more surgically guided sanctions against the way that people are breaking the sanctions regimes in Iran. A really great thing coming out of Germany was largely Green Party MPs in Germany taking up the cases of very specific people on death row about to face execution in Iran and just not shutting up about them. And actually that seems to have had some sort of effect. And finally, like, I think this is probably true of both of us. You know, I would say that, like, if you want to know, if you're a Persian speaker, if you can speak the language, you want to know what is going on in Iran today, you don't understand that by watching Iranian TV or Iranian newspapers. It is not a very good idea to be a talented journalist in Iran for the obvious reasons. What you watch is things like BBC Persian, you watch the Radio Free Europe network. There is a broader cultural role that the West can play, which is not to do with military intervention and that kind of stuff, but which is about going, what does a pro-democracy foreign policy look like, as opposed to a let's launder some money for some oligarchs foreign policy.
All right. Well, on that note of optimism, which I can't share because quiet desperation is the English way, I'd like to thank both Afshin Shahi, Javad Alipur, who will be joining you for the sequel of this, which I'm sure you will enjoy. Thank you for being here. Thank you for being at the Bradford Literature Festival. Enjoy the rest of your day. Enjoy the rest of the weekend. Thank you so much.
Thank you for listening. If you enjoyed this episode and would like to support the festival, please subscribe, share this episode with others, and leave a rating. Don't forget to mark your calendars as the Bradford Literature Festival returns for its 10th year from 28th of June to the 7th of July 2024.